Hamas has released all the living hostages as part of the ceasefire deal with Israel. The liberation bringing what many hope to be an end to the war once and for all between the militant group and Israel. More than 1,900 Palestinian prisoners are also being released by Israel today, leading to celebrations from families of those hostages seeing their family members for the first time in more than 700 days. Maxim Harkin's family celebrating as they watch video of him being returned to Israel today. Scripps News international correspondent Blake Sifton is in Tel Aviv for us. Good morning, Blake. What a day to be there. All living hostages now released. So how did this all play out? And what about the remains of the hostages who are the hostages who are no longer alive, and these Palestinian prisoners being released today? Can you give us an update?
Good morning, Holly. We had the first release of the first batch of living Israeli hostages at around 8 a.m. local time this morning. They were handed over by Hamas to the Red Cross. They were then taken to Israeli forces who brought them to a military base. There they reunited with their families and were given initial medical treatment. A second group was delivered to the Red Cross a few hours later. And then at that point, all 20 living Israeli hostages were returned to Israel. They've been brought in groups from that military base near the Gaza border to medical centers here in Tel Aviv. And I actually just saw another helicopter with hostages aboard in the sky over to my right, because as they're coming into Tel Aviv throughout the day, they've been doing flyovers over Hostage Square, where tens of thousands of people have been gathered since the early morning, watching large screens, watching the images of the hostages being reunited with their families, and really enjoying and celebrating a great moment and a great deal of relief after 2 years of protests in that very square. However, while there's been plenty of relief and joy there, just in the last little while, we're getting information about the release of the deceased hostages, the 28 deceased hostages. Now, we had understood that not all of them would be released today. U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff had told hostage families that it would be difficult to find some of them, and that an international team will assist with retrieving bodies. However, the umbrella group that represents the family members of the hostages have said that they were told, that they understand now, that only 4 of the 28 hostages' bodies will be released today. Now, they've said that they are shocked and dismayed by this information, and they've called it a blatant breach of the agreement by Hamas. There's been no official confirmation by the Israeli government of that situation yet, but this is the main hostage group. Now, once the living hostages were released, Israel began releasing the Palestinian prisoners it is exchanging. That includes 1,700 people who've been detained in Gaza since the war began 2 years ago. Among them are children, women, as well as medical professionals seized when Israel raided hospitals. They have begun just in the last little while arriving in Khan Yunis to huge crowds and celebrations there. They will also undergo medical treatment and be reunited with their families. We've also seen the release of the 250 so-called security prisoners. These are prisoners serving life sentences in Israeli jails. They were taken from a prison in the West Bank. Many of them were then taken to Ramallah, the main city in the West Bank. Others were released, a much smaller number, but others were released into East Jerusalem, and still further from that group of security prisoners, some will be taken to Gaza, and many more will be sent into exile abroad.
And Blake, President Trump is in the Middle East, so how is he being received, and what did he have to say in his address to Israel's parliament this morning? He spoke in front of the Knesset. And what's next on his agenda? Does he stay in Israel? Does he leave? What do we know?
So he's really received something of a hero's welcome, and this really is a victory tour of sorts. He arrived at Ben Gurion Airport to a red carpet ceremony, was welcomed by Prime Minister Netanyahu as well as President Herzog. In the hostage square, the crowds have been chanting his name all day. He's received Israel's highest honor, highest civilian prize. And he went to the Knesset in Jerusalem. He had further meetings. He met hostage families there. And his central message, really, since he left the United States and arrived in Israel, has been that the war is over. He was asked about that before leaving. He confirmed it is. He was asked by a reporter, and when he got to the Knesset, he said, yes, the war is over. When he entered the Knesset, he was given a 2.5-minute standing ovation. And in that speech, he thanked Prime Minister Netanyahu. He praised him. He thanked his team, including Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, as well as Jared Kushner. And he said the long and painful nightmare is finally over. He reiterated time and time again that the war is over. Now, that does seem to be a purposeful effort to leave no misunderstanding, leave no room for interpretation, that though far-right members of Netanyahu's coalition have said that once the hostages are released, if Hamas is not dismantled or destroyed, that Israel should go back to war. But President Trump has been unequivocal in his insistence that the war is over, and he has provided guarantees to the international community as well as to Hamas that Israel will not go back to war and that future developments will be negotiated. And that's where the next step of his trip comes in. He is now going to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where he will co-chair a meeting of more than 20 world leaders who are really trying to carry forward this momentum that got us to this point, to the agreement in this first stage of the deal. And they are trying to implement the full peace plan, the full 20-point peace plan that President Trump has proposed. The rest of this, the rest of the realization will be much harder to reach. There are major obstacles to overcome, like the disarming of Hamas, deciding on the composition of this transitional government that's meant to govern Gaza, as well as this international stabilization force that's meant to enter Gaza and assist with demilitarization. Israel's full withdrawal from Gaza is tied to their progress. And so far, we haven't learned yet which countries will contribute, when it will be assembled, and when it will be ready to deploy. So that will be a major topic of discussion at these talks, and we expect to hear announcements and commitments related to that force.
All right, a lot of work ahead, but today we will use the day to celebrate at least this small step. Scripps News international correspondent Blake Sifton for us. Thank you.